Tonight, we begin with a question that has constitutional scholars working around the clock, a question that Federal Reserve officials say keeps them up at night, a question that legal analysts are calling the most consequential facing the American economy in a generation. Will the Supreme Court continue to protect the Federal Reserve from Donald Trump? Or will decades of constitutional precedent crumble under pressure from a president who sources say is determined to seize control of the nation's money supply? The answer could come sooner than anyone expected. And what happens next will affect every American. To understand why this question matters, why economists speaking to multiple outlets are using words like catastrophic and unprecedented, you need to understand what is actually on the line. This isn't an abstract legal debate. This isn't something that only affects Wall Street, bankers, and Washington lawyers. This is about your money, your savings, your retirement, the value of every dollar in your wallet. The Federal Reserve controls interest rates. It controls inflation. It controls the fundamental stability of the American economy, and for over a century, it has done so independently, free from political pressure, free from presidential demands, free from the kind of manipulation that has destroyed economies around the world. That independence rests on a single foundation: legal protection. That says the president cannot fire the Fed chair at will. Protection that says monetary policy cannot be dictated by the Oval Office. Protection that, according to legal scholars, could be stripped away by the Supreme Court. And according to sources familiar with the administration's thinking, that's exactly what Donald Trump wants: not influence, not input, control. And the only thing standing in his way is 9 justices who will soon have to decide: does the Constitution protect the Federal Reserve? Or does it give the president power over your money? Now, for months, legal observers have been tracking signals, quiet signals, the kind that only those who spend their careers studying the Supreme Court would notice, cases being selected for review that seemed routine but weren't, oral arguments where certain justices asked questions that made constitutional lawyers nervous, opinions in unrelated cases that contained language-specific, deliberate language that experts recognized as laying groundwork. Groundwork for what? According to legal analysts speaking on background, groundwork for dismantling the independent agency framework that has protected institutions like the Federal Reserve for generations. The doctrine is called unitary executive theory, and sources say the current Supreme Court is more sympathetic to it than any court in modern history. What does it mean in plain English? It means the president controls everything in the executive branch. Everything, no exceptions, no independence, no protection for agencies, including the Fed, that were designed to operate outside political control. And the signals, according to those tracking the court, suggest a majority may be ready to embrace this theory, not hypothetically, not in some distant future case. Now, in decisions that are already working their way through the system, decisions that could reach the Supreme Court within months, decisions that could fundamentally transform the relationship between the presidency and the American economy. So what exactly is happening? What cases are moving through the courts? And what has legal experts so alarmed? Let's start with what we know, according to constitutional scholars and legal analysts speaking to multiple outlets. There are currently 3 separate legal tracks that could determine the fate of Federal Reserve independence. Track 1, direct challenges to removal protections. The law currently says the president can only remove the Fed chair for cause, meaning serious misconduct, not policy disagreement. This protection is what keeps the Fed independent. Without it, any president could fire any Fed chair who refuses to do their bidding. According to legal experts, the administration has been exploring challenges to this protection, not publicly. Not through official channels, but through cases and arguments that, if successful, would eliminate for-cause protection entirely. And the Supreme Court, sources say, has shown interest. Track 2, the broader independent agency question. The Federal Reserve isn't the only independent agency. There's the SEC, the FTC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. All of them have some form of removal protection, and the Supreme Court has already been chipping away at that protection, case by case, year by year, building a body of precedent that, according to legal scholars, points in one direction: toward presidential control. If the court rules that independent agencies are unconstitutional, that the president must have removal power over all executive officials, the Fed's protection falls with everything else. And according to court watchers, that ruling could come as soon as the next term. Track 3, the specific Fed challenge. Sources familiar with legal strategy say there are parties actively looking for the right case. A case that would put Federal Reserve independence directly before the Supreme Court. A case designed to force the justices to rule on whether the Fed structure is constitutional. That case hasn't reached the court yet. But according to those tracking the legal landscape, it's coming maybe this year, maybe next, but it's coming. And when it arrives, according to legal experts, the outcome is far from certain. Because this Supreme Court, this particular configuration of justices, has shown repeatedly that it's willing to overturn precedent, willing to reshape constitutional understanding, willing to do what previous courts would not, and Federal Reserve independence, sources say, may be next on the list. The response from those who understand. What's at stake has been urgent. First, former Fed officials speaking out. According to sources in the financial community, former Federal Reserve chairs and governors, Republicans and Democrats alike, have been raising alarms. Not through official channels, but through back channels, through calls to current officials, through quiet conversations with members of Congress. Their message, according to those familiar with these discussions, this is not a partisan issue. This is an existential threat to economic stability. They've seen what happens when central banks lose independence. They've studied the historical examples. They've watched other countries suffer the consequences, and they're terrified it could happen here. Second, economic institutions mobilizing. According to sources in the financial sector, major banks and investment firms have been conducting internal assessments, war gaming scenarios, trying to understand what happens to markets, to lending, to the entire financial system if the Fed loses its independence. The conclusions, sources say, are alarming: capital flight, currency instability, inflation that spirals beyond control, the kind of economic chaos that doesn't just hurt portfolios, it destroys lives. And these institutions, according to those familiar with their thinking, are trying to figure out how to prevent it. Third, legal scholars organizing. According to academics speaking to multiple outlets, constitutional law professors from across the ideological spectrum are preparing amicus briefs, preparing arguments, preparing to make the case to the Supreme Court that Federal Reserve independence is not just good policy, it is constitutionally protected. Whether the court will listen is another question. And fourth, and this is what sources say has the administration most confident, the silence from Congress. Because Congress could act. Congress could pass legislation explicitly protecting Fed independence. Congress could make clear that the removal protections are intentional and constitutional. But according to sources on Capitol Hill, that legislation isn't moving. Republicans who might privately support Fed independence won't publicly break with the president. Democrats are focused on other priorities. And every day of congressional inaction, according to legal experts, makes the court challenge more likely to succeed. Because when Congress is silent, courts have more room to interpret, more room to reshape, more room to do what this Supreme Court has shown it's willing to do. So what would actually happen if the Supreme Court rules against Fed independence? What would it mean for the economy, for your life, for America's place in the world? Let's walk through the consequences. Consequence 1, political control of interest rates. Right now, the Federal Reserve sets interest rates based on economic data, inflation numbers, employment figures. The technical indicators that trained economists spend their careers analyzing. If the president controls the Fed, according to economists speaking to multiple outlets, that changes interest rates become political tools. Lower rates before elections to boost the economy. Policy decisions based on political calendars rather than economic realities. The result? According to virtually every economist who has studied the question, boom and bust cycles that devastate ordinary Americans, short-term gains followed by painful corrections, the kind of instability that wipes out savings, destroys jobs, and leaves families struggling for years. Consequence 2, inflation. Independent central banks keep inflation in check. That's not theory. That's historical fact. Countries with independent central banks have lower, more stable inflation than countries without. And inflation, according to economists, is a tax on everyone. It erodes savings. It raises prices. It hurts the poor and middle class most of all. If the Fed loses independence, sources say inflation becomes a presidential choice, and presidents facing re-election have every incentive to tolerate higher inflation for short-term economic boosts. The result? According to analysts, your dollars buy less, your retirement stretches shorter, your economic security evaporates. Consequence 3, dollar dominance. The American dollar is the world's reserve currency. That's not an accident. It's because international investors trust American economic institutions, trust that monetary policy is stable, trust that the Fed won't be manipulated for political purposes. If the Supreme Court eliminates Fed independence, according to international economists, that trust evaporates, other countries start looking for alternatives. The dollar weakens, America's economic power diminishes, and that affects everything: trade deals, military spending, the fundamental ability of the United States to project power around the world. Consequence for the precedent. If this president can control the Fed, so can the next one, and the one after that. The damage isn't just from one administration. It's permanent, structural, built into the system. According to historians who study economic institutions, once independence is lost, it's almost never recovered. The political incentives are too strong, the temptation too great. This isn't a temporary setback, sources say. It's a permanent transformation, a transformation that would make the American economy fundamentally less stable, less trustworthy, and less resilient. And the Supreme Court, 9 unelected justices, may be about to make it happen. So what about the Supreme Court itself? What are the justices thinking? And how might they rule? According to court watchers and legal analysts speaking to multiple outlets, the picture is concerning. Let's start with the conservative majority. 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents. 6 justices who have shown, in case after case, a willingness to embrace expansive theories of presidential power. 6 justices who have already weakened independent agencies in recent terms. According to legal scholars who have analyzed their opinions, at least 4 of these justices have indicated skepticism toward the independent agency framework. Skepticism that sources say could easily extend to the Federal Reserve. Justice Thomas has been the most explicit. His opinions have called the entire independent agency structure into question. According to constitutional law professors, he would almost certainly vote against Fed independence. Justice Gorsuch has raised similar concerns. His writings on the separation of powers suggest deep hostility to agencies that operate outside presidential control. Justice Alito and Justice Kavanaugh have been more cautious in their language. But according to analysts, their votes in related cases suggest they lean toward expansive executive power. Justice Barrett is harder to read, but sources say her judicial philosophy, originalism, textualism, could lead her to question protections that aren't explicitly in the Constitution. And Chief Justice Roberts, according to court watchers, he's the wild card. The justice who has occasionally broken with conservatives on major cases. The justice who seems concerned about the court's legitimacy and legacy. Would he vote to upend a century of economic stability? Would he hand this president or any president control over the money supply? Sources say it's genuinely uncertain. But the fact that it is uncertain, the fact that Federal Reserve independence depends on the inclinations of one man, should alarm everyone, because it means protection is not guaranteed. It means the unthinkable is thinkable. It means everything could change with a single ruling. So what happens next? What should you be watching for? And is there anything that can stop this? First, watch the court docket. According to legal analysts, several cases in the pipeline could become vehicles for challenging Fed independence, cases about other agencies that could establish precedents, cases specifically designed to force the issue. When the Supreme Court announces which cases it will hear next term, pay attention. The selection itself tells you where the court is heading. Second, watch for direct administration action. Sources say the White House has been exploring whether to challenge Fed independence directly, whether to attempt removal of officials and force a court fight. If that happens, if the administration tries to fire the Fed chair or other governors, it triggers immediate legal battles that could reach the Supreme Court within months. Watch for confrontation. Watch for the administration testing boundaries. Watch for the kind of provocation that creates legal opportunities. Third, watch Congress. There is still time for legislation. There is still opportunity for Congress to act, to reaffirm Fed independence, to make clear that removal protections are constitutional and intentional. According to sources on Capitol Hill, such legislation exists in draft form. It has sponsors. It could pass if leadership prioritized it. But according to those same sources, it's not being prioritized. It's languishing, waiting for a crisis that may come too late. If Congress acts, it changes the legal landscape. It makes the Supreme Court's job harder. It provides a democratic endorsement of Fed independence that even this court might respect. But if Congress continues to do nothing, then the fate of the American economy rests entirely with 9 justices. Justices who serve for life, justices who answer to no one, justices who may be about to reshape the economic foundations of the country. And fourth, watch the markets. According to financial analysts, sophisticated investors are already pricing in the possibility, already hedging against the scenario. already making decisions based on the assumption that Fed independence may not survive. If those movements accelerate, if markets start showing genuine fear, it could create pressure on Congress, on the administration, on the court itself. Markets are forward-looking. They price in futures before they happen. And right now, according to sources in the financial community, they're pricing in something they never thought possible: the end of Federal Reserve independence, the end of a century of economic stability, the end of the institutional framework that made America the world's dominant economy. This is not normal. That's what every expert we spoke to emphasized. This is not normal. For over 100 years, the independence of the Federal Reserve has been protected by law, protected by precedent, protected by the understanding that some institutions are too important to be political. That protection is now in jeopardy, not because of some inevitable historical force. Not because the Constitution requires it, but because this president wants control. This Supreme Court may give it to him, and this Congress is doing nothing to stop it. Will the Supreme Court continue to protect the Federal Reserve? According to the experts, the scholars, the analysts who have spent their careers studying these questions, the answer is, we don't know. And that uncertainty, that genuine, terrifying uncertainty about whether America's economic institutions will survive, should concern every single American. Your savings, your retirement, your job, the price of everything you buy. All of it depends on a Federal Reserve that can make decisions based on economics, not politics. That Fed has existed for generations. It may not exist much longer. Not if the Supreme Court rules the way many expect. Not if Congress continues to do nothing. Not if the American people don't understand what's at stake. Now you understand. Now you know. The question is, what happens next? If you believe the American economy deserves protection from political control, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell, because this story is developing. And the decisions being made in the coming months will affect your financial future for the rest of your life. Drop a comment below. Do you trust this Supreme Court to protect the Federal Reserve? What would you tell your representatives if you had the chance? And share this video. Share it with everyone who has savings, everyone who has a retirement account, everyone who cares about economic stability. The mainstream media is not covering this story. They're not connecting the dots. They're not explaining what's really at stake. We are, and we need your help to spread the word. The future of the American economy may depend on it. We'll see you tomorrow.